It's great to see an audience. I've been looking at red lights and wondering was there anyone there at all. So now I have the opportunity of seeing you when I'm talking to you. And of course this is great. I can see if you fall asleep, fall off your chairs, start thumping your phones to see if they stopped. And of course on the other hand, the great advantage is that you can't turn me off. So you're here for the long haul. It's great to be back. It's great to be back in Dundalk. It's great to be back. I went to school in Dundalk for 5 years. And I lived out in Stabannon on the other side of Castle Bellingham, and we came in on the bus every day. And the Fairways Hotel, boy has it come on since we were going by on the bus in the 1960s. I could hardly recognise the place. I couldn't work out how to get in. So I must say it's great onwards and upwards. Now today I'm going to talk to you about biodiversity and climate change. And really and truly, I think at long last, I'm beginning to sound like the fellow in Dawson Street who was there for more years than he could care to remember. I've been talking about this for more years than I could care to remember. But I think eventually people actually are beginning to get this. I mean, for a long time you had to produce the figures. You had to say, look, there's the global temperature for the last 150 years is 1856. And you can see on one half of the diagram, the average was, some years they were red, some years they were blue, up and down, up and down. That's what averages are about. Some years it's warmer, some years it's colder. But once we get to about 1926, it never goes below the red line again. And it gets warmer and warmer and warmer every year. And the temperature of the world is irrefutably getting warmer. And of course, you can put that into a great big complicated graph here, and you can see that there's three things involved with this. First of all, you have that zigzag line at the back, that red line going up and down, and that's the temperature. Now this line here is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you can see again way back 1,000 years ago, because this graph covers 1,000 years, you had a certain amount up and down, but then since about the middle of the 1800s, the amount of carbon dioxide has gone up and up and up and up and up. And now we have something like 400 parts per million, where when they started measuring it 1,000 years ago, but they weren't measuring it 1,000 years ago, but they were able to find bubbles in the ice and measure what it was 270. So it's gone hugely up. And of course the third line, why is all this happening? And the third line tells us why it's all happening. It tells us that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from, first of all, this is land use change. This is the way the forests were, this is the way the world was 1,000 years ago. And then we started to cut down the forests, we started to grow crops. And then the second thing we discovered was fossil fuels. We could burn coal, we could burn oil, we could burn gas and put more carbon up into the atmosphere. So changing the land use from forestry, cutting down the trees, growing grass in order to have cattle, and actually burning fossil fuels as well. So they all correspond. In other words, we did it. We are the people who caused climate change. Jackie Healy-Rae and Danny Healy-Rae and all the rest of them can say things happened before, and sure wasn't there a time when there was no ice on the world at all. This is very true. There was a time when there was no ice in the world at all, 350 million years ago, but the change happened very slowly over the time that it changed from having no ice to having ice. We have done all of this in 200 years. That's at the speed of light relative to 350,000 billion years ago when we were talking about the Carboniferous era. So you're not at all comparing like with like. We have changed the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that is what has caused climate change. If you look at that, there's a little bit of science for you. You have the yellow sun. The yellow sun is shining down upon the earth. It's shining down with those yellow lines, heating us up. The heat comes through the atmosphere onto the earth and warms us up. And then it bounces off the earth and is reflected back out into space. If it didn't, we'd all boil. So the thing is, it doesn't all go. Some of it is retained. So you can see the stuff going out to space there, the red lines going up in the air. But some of it, as you can see, is coming back. And why is that? That's because it comes in at a certain speed. All of the heat can come through the atmosphere. It hits the earth, it's slowed down and it goes back out slower. Like the way if I got a football and threw it at the wall, when it would hit the wall and come back, it would come back slower. When you hit something, it goes slower. So the heat comes in at a certain speed, certain wavelength, in it all comes. Hits the earth, slows down, goes back slower, different shape, longer wavelength. It can't go through carbon dioxide. So if the atmosphere for some mad reason was 100% carbon dioxide, none of it would go out and we'd all boil to death. If there was no carbon dioxide at all, it would all go out and we'd all freeze. So scientists have called this the Goldilocks Effect. You know, one was too hot, one porridge was too cold, and one was just right. So we have the Goldilocks Effect. We have enough carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to keep in enough heat to keep life on Earth. But the thing is, we have zapped it up in the last 200 years and we're holding in more heat than we did before. And as a consequence, our climate is changing. That's one of these trucks on the M50 being blown over by one of the hurricanes that we had in the last year or two. This is a place down, I think it's in Wexford, where the river has burst its banks and some person in a car didn't realise it was as bad as that. So as a consequence, we're not talking about it's something that's happening. It's happening even in Ireland. Now, we are actually nearly halfway between the North Pole and the equator. We're the last place on Earth to be affected by climate change, and we're beginning to feel it. The ice is melting like mad up in the North Pole. The place on the Horn of Africa, Somalia and Ethiopia are completely arid, hasn't rained there for 4 years, people are dying of drought. We're in the middle, us in New Zealand, and we're beginning to feel it. So you can imagine that it's not just we have to wait till it comes to our door before we believe it. Even us, even we are feeling it now, and other people have been putting up with it for years. So it's incumbent upon us to do something about this, because the window of opportunity to stop behaving the way we are and to make it change and make it for the better is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Soon we'll have fallen off the cliff and people will be saying, well, why didn't you do it? You were told, you knew, why didn't you do it? So that's my little lecture over on that point. Now, biodiversity then. We already had Peter was explaining to us about biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is a new made-up word. When I was going to school, me and Finn McCool, below in the Mercy Convent in the 1960s, there was no such thing as biodiversity. Never been mentioned. But what it actually is it's just two words together. Biology, biological, which means life, and diversity means difference. So it's lots of different living things. So it's lots of different species, it's lots of different habitats where they live, and it's lots of different genetic variation even within a species. So something that's a clone has no genetic variation. They're all the same. If the conditions change, they'll all die. So that's where we need into three things for biodiversity. It's not just all the different species. We have to have different places as well. So if we completely lived on a bog, we'd never see seashore plants. If we completely lived in a woodland, we'd never be able to see things that grew in a lake. So the more habitats we have, the more places we have for things to grow. Now, biodiversity then, lots of different species will they all depend on each other. We have food chains, we have food cycles, we have food webs, we have all of these things. So as I particularly chose maybe to talk to you today about bees and pollination, I'm just going to look at this particular aspect of it. So what you're looking at there is a honeybee, and a honeybee is going to visit a flower. And we're all told, oh, we need these for pollination. Now, what's pollination? And do the bees have a meeting every morning and say, let's go out and pollinate a few flowers? I mean, what is pollination and how does it actually happen? This is a roadside verge up in County Meath where the tidy townspeople have actually decided that they're going to have a wildflower verge along the edge of the road rather than what was there before. So there are lots of different flowers there, and this is much better for biodiversity than what was there before. So I'll just give you a small little biology lecture. I used to be a teacher. In fact, I was once a teacher, always a teacher. So here we go. This is what we're talking about. Now, pollination is sex for flowers. Sex for anything means that if you want to have offspring, the male part must meet the female part, grow together and produce the baby. And it's exactly the same with flowers, with plants. That's what we're talking about. So here's just a stylized version of a flower cut through in the half. So you have two stalks, one to the left and one to the right, and these are the male parts. These are called the anthers, and on top of the anthers we have the pollen. So that's the male part of the flower. The bit in the middle, that's like a stalk up in the air and a big round thing at the bottom, that's the female part, that's the ovary, and the stigma at the top of the ovary is sticky. So the anther produces the pollen has to land on the female sticky part, grow down into the middle of it, fertilise it, and that will swell up and become the baby, which of course in the case of plants are the seeds. If we don't have any seeds, we won't have any more plants. That's essentially how it works. Now the thing is, you don't fertilise yourself. That would be a mortal sin of the highest order. Can't do that. So even though the plant has male and female parts, it can't do it to itself. Not allowed. Well, you could do it if you tried, because remember I showed you the 3 bits of biodiversity, and the 3rd bit was genetic variation. If you fertilise yourself, you have no variation. You have the same genes meeting the same genes, giving you, incest and giving you, self-fertility and sterilisation and all. If you even were to manage to do this, you wouldn't get offspring, they wouldn't be fertile, it wouldn't work. So nature wouldn't happen, because even if the thing happened. So if the flower doesn't get its act together, there are not going to be any more of them. So very cleverly what the flower does is, or has evolved to do, the flower doesn't decide this, is that the male and the female parts are not ripe at the same time. So the pollen is not ripe at the same time as the female part, so the accident can't happen, it can't happen. But that's not much good. Here you are, you're a flower over here, your pollen is ripe. And here's some other flower over there, its pollen was ripe before, now its female part is ripe. How are you going to get it from one to the other? You need the postman. You need someone to bring it. And that's what the insects are. That's what the pollinators are. They're the postmen. Now, would you work for nothing? If I said come home and scrub my floor for nothing, because the privilege of scrubbing Eanna Ní Lámhna's floor, surely that would be enough. They'd say, get real. If I said, come home and scrub my floor and I'll pay you €1,000 a square foot, there'd be a queue waiting to go home with me. It's the same with the insects. They're not going to go out and say, let us pollinate some flowers, wouldn't that be a good thing to do? What they say is, let's go to the pub. Because that's what they're doing. The pub is the flower. The flower has to pay the postman, and what the flower does, it pays for it in drink. And the drink is the nectar. The nectar that the flower, being not an Egypt, the flower actually has the nectar hidden away down below the ovary. So for you to get a free drink in the pub, you have to stick your head right in, get your nectar. Lovely, this is a great job, but the pub only has one drink. What kind of a pub is that? And you take your head out, you fly on to the next flower, stick your head in again for another free drink. Now your head, as you know, if the flower, your first flower, the pollen was all ripe, then your head is all covered, your hairy head is all covered in pollen. Go on to the next flower, more nectar, stick your head in. This time it's the female part that's ripe. You don't care, you're only getting the free drink, but your hairy head now touches off the female part, and the pollen is moved over from one to the other, and fertilization happens. And that simply is what pollination is. And it's not just bees that do it. All the different insects that want to go to the pub, they're all at it. Now there's a fly, for example, with just 2 wings. It's not a bee at all, and it's there on a wild rose looking for a drink as well. So when the fertilization happens, then I'm just showing you a tomato so you can see what I'm talking about. That green thing on the top of the tomato was where it was joining the plant. So all that's left of that flower are just that green collection of sepals. They're under the petals, and then the female part of the tomato was fertilized. It swelled up, being the fruit, and inside were all the seeds. And that's what you need to get. If you grew your tomato plants inside in a glass case, inside in the house, kept away all the insects, you'd have lovely flowers, but you wouldn't have a single tomato because the fertilization wouldn't have happened. Here's, for example, members of the pea family, and you can see these are vetches, and again you have the flowers, you have the bits of things stuck behind the sepals, and then your pods are the female part that has been fertilized, swelled up, and inside are your peas. In the case of the vetches, they're little baby black peas. In your garden crop, they can be the ones that we might eat. Here's something like the wild rose. This one particular is a hawthorn. You see all the flowers out at the moment on the hawthorn. I was just looking at them coming down. And again, covered in insects who are out for the jar. And as a consequence, when they fertilise it, all the rest of the flower will fall away. You'll have the female part fertilised. So that's what pollination is, a complete accident caused by drunken insects going to the pub. Now, I did mention bees in particular. Bees, I think, probably have a bit more discipline. Bees are the only creatures, the only insects, the only creatures that actually want pollen. For the rest of them, for the butterflies, for the flies, for the wasps, for all of those creatures, the pollen is a bloody nuisance. You have to stick your head into the drink, your head gets covered in pollen, and when you go home to your mammy in the evening time and she says, where were you all day? Were you in the pub? Look at the cut of your head. It's covered in pollen. The pollen is just a nuisance, the price you have to pay for the drink. But in the case of the bees, they have a double job to do, because the pollen that is produced, that male part, is full of protein. And the bees, only the bees, gather that pollen to feed their babies with. So you have Mrs. Queen Bee in the hive, she's laying the eggs, they're hatching out, and they have to be fed by the sisters, by the workers. And they go out and they gather pollen in pollen baskets on their legs. And they bring the pollen back home, they make it into a protein bread, and they feed the babies with it. And for 3 weeks, the bees, whether they're honeybees or queen bees, sorry, the queens don't do that and only lay eggs, honeybees or bumblebees, solitary bees, we have about 99 species of all sorts of bees in Ireland, and they all need protein, they all need pollen to feed their young. So you're 3 weeks collecting that, and then you are promoted to adult duties. And then you're sent off again, and this time you're collecting the nectar. You're actually collecting the nectar. You're not just drinking the free drink in the pub. You're filling up your nectar sack, you bring it back to your hive, your nest, and you evaporate the water off it, and you make it into honey, and that's what the adult bees eat. So like anything else, you don't eat the baby food. The babies get the protein out of the pollen. The adults get the honey that they make from the nectar. And after 6 weeks, you die of exhaustion. So if someone says to you, you're as busy as a bee, I'm telling you, you better sit down and put your feet up. Bees only last for 6 weeks. So that's a bumblebee, that particular one. You can see it's like wearing an orange fur coat over its shoulders. That's a carder bee. And here it is in a nice open flower, like a sunflower, and it's collecting, in this instance, it's collecting the pollen. And if you look at bees, when you look at them in flowers, you can actually see if they're collecting pollen, because their pollen baskets will be full on their back legs, or if their head's away in the flower altogether, they're obviously on nectar collecting duties. But as I said, the rest of them are just freeloaders out for the drink. Here's a thing called a drone fly, and the drone fly, you can see it sticking his mouth away down into it. Somebody sent me in that picture to know what it was, and you can see how furry that fly is when you see it so close up. And it's all covered in pollen. You can see all the pollen grains on its head and on its back, and it's trying to stick its tongue down and keep away from all the pollen. But as I said, the flower, not being an Aegis, hasn't got the nectar sitting at the door. The insect has to come right in. Butterflies are great pollinators as well. Now, we all know about butterflies. Butterflies lay eggs, they hatch out into caterpillars, and the caterpillars are eating machines. And they eat and eat and eat until they burst. Now, they don't burst with a big explosion all around the room. It's more like an Incredible Hulk job, where their skin gets too tight and they shrug it off. And they have a bigger skin, like getting off your tight corset, and they feel a lot better, they're a bit hairier. And they do this 5 times, and at that stage then, if they see another bit of this food, they'll just die. So they go away, crawl up into a stem, and they pupate into a butterfly. Now, butterflies have no tummies, they've no guts, they never eat, they don't do poos. All they do is look for other butterflies with a view to forming liaisons, lay eggs, and die. But God wasn't that mean to them. God said, okay, you can have a drink, you can have a drink. So this is why the butterflies are going to the flowers, they're drinking the nectar as well. So I suppose you could nearly say your flowers are sort of singles bars for butterflies. The butterflies come, and some of the plants that we grow, whether they're wildflowers or whether they're things like buddleia that you might plant in your garden, they're particularly suitable for butterflies. They're open, the butterflies can get into it, and they drink. But the nectar is just to keep them from being dehydrated while they're doing the mating and laying the eggs. And then after a period of time, they'll die. Now, depending on how big you are as a butterfly, we went off to Costa Rica once to make a rainforest program when RTE had money. A fact-finding mission, isn't that what they call such junkets? Anyway, and we saw butterflies there that were as big as my hand. 2 big wings, you couldn't imagine such a thing. Now, they only lasted for about a day because the amount of energy they used up finding the mate, laying the eggs, it was like as if you had a Lamborghini and the fill of petrol just was, boom, all gone in a lovely show. Whereas our fellas here, or this one here, the small tortoise shell, are more like Morris Minors. Your fill of petrol might last for a fortnight. And they fly around, and some of these will actually hibernate as an adult, so you might see them in the house over the winter time. But they don't get any more energy as a butterfly. Once they get onto that stage, that's the end of the life cycle. They lay the eggs and off they go. Now, wasps are another crowd that come along and also are good pollinators. Now, wasps, of course, people think wasps are made by God to sting us. And not only can they sting us, but they don't even have the decency to die like a bee does when it stings us. They can sting us several times. Wasps are a terrible nuisance. We all hate them and we wish they were extinct. Well, I don't want to hear any more of that rubbish. Wasps are really, really important. If you had no wasps in your garden, you'd know all about it. You mightn't know you have wasps there until the end of the summer. But wasps are carnivores. Wasps collect green flies, black flies, white flies, chew them all up, bring them back and feed their babies with them. That's what wasps do. So Mabby wasp comes out of hibernation in March, builds a big paper nest, builds a little paper nest, lays the eggs, they hatch out, and the worker wasps then are going to have to feed the babies after that and build the nest. So it's a golf ball, it's a tennis ball, it's a football, and by the time September comes, it's absolutely enormous, and people notice it for the first time. But all that time, those 40,000 wasps have been gathered in all that green flies and black flies and white flies out of your garden, chewing them up and feeding the baby wasps with. But like the bees, grown-up wasps don't eat baby food. They eat sugar. And where do they get it? It's very wonderful. What happens is those grubs that they're feeding when they've got their dinner, they exude a sugary solution. So what you have is, here's your dinner, lick, lick. Here's your dinner, lick, lick. And we never get any trouble with wasps. All during the summer, you can sit outside, you can drink gin and tonics and jam sandwiches, and a wasp never comes near you. But then come September, go back to school, the end of August, oh, we're plagued with wasps. What has happened? And what has happened quite simply is that the queen wasp, who has laid 40,000 eggs, is worn to a flither. You'd be worn to a flither if you laid 40,000 eggs as well. And she's getting weak. The sisters in the hive or in the nest notice this. They build different shaped cells, and she lays eggs that are going to be fed up to be queens, fed up to be drones, the reproductive wasps, in fact. And they fly off and they mate up in the air, and then the queen wasps then that are mated, the young ones, they go off to hibernate. So they're gone over winter, they're gone. So now Mrs. Queen is absolutely flattened altogether now at this point, lays another 1,000 eggs and dies. Mrs. Queen is gone. Wasps, those worker wasps, can live for about 6 weeks. So that crowd that were laid at the beginning of September, the end of August, have 6 weeks to live. So the sisters feed them up, the sisters die, and now they're the next young and upcoming generation. There's nobody to feed, they're the youngest, yippee, no work to do. But there's nobody to lick. So where are you going to get your sugar? So now you're flying around saying, we're very good at smelling sugar, but we're not much good at seeing. Now you can get it on plums that fell down, you can get it on flowers that are well open. We know the smell of this. And they fly into this room, for example, and here's all these lovely flowers. We all have our hair done with Timotei shampoo. We've all washed our clothes in Radiant and Comfort. We're all spraying our Oxfords with Chanel No. 5. Sure, we all smell like flowers. And along comes the wasp and flies around your hair. Because after all, if you smell like a flower, you probably have food. And you sit there calmly and the wasp says, that's not much good. And goes on to the next one, flies around their head, they're not much good either, flies on to another one and then says, hump this for a game of soldiers, and departs. Now, do you sit there calmly if a wasp comes and flies around your head? Of course you don't. You start whacking it with a newspaper or something and the wasp stings you. Now, look at it from a point of view of the wasp. Who pretended to be a flower? Who dressed up in flower perfume? Who had no food? Who attacked first? You did. And then the poor wasp stings you and mealy murder breaks out. So for the month of September, you wash your hair in coal tar soap. You wash your clothes in carbonic soap, and you don't go around whacking them, because that's what's happening. And indeed, by the end of the next 6 weeks, they'll have lived their life cycle. They'll be gone. That big paper nest will never be occupied again. And Mrs. Queen, when she comes out the next year, starts off again with a golf ball. And those wasps in your garden have done a huge amount of work, collected all these green flies and stuff. And indeed, at the end of the year, for the month of September, when they're not attacking you to get the promised food that isn't there, they visit flowers and they pollinate as well. Now, the thing is that birds who don't come to my lectures much, the birds know very well to fear anything that's black and yellow, because you'll get stung. So anything that's black and yellow, you don't attack. Now, the birds are the big enemies of insects, so if you look like something savage, maybe you could fool the birds. So what's that? That's a hoverfly. That's only a fly. It's got big fly eyes. It's only got 2 wings. It's not got 4 wings. It doesn't have a sting. That can't do any harm. There's the wasp with the stripy eyes and the small antennae. There's the hoverfly, and they're very like each other. So, of course, the hoverfly who goes round wearing wasp pyjamas gets away with it. And we get lots of hoverflies in our gardens. We get lots of hoverflies visiting our flowers. Here's another one here, a different species again. Again, the hoverflies, like all the other flies, are just freeloaders going to the pub for a pint. The pint is hidden away down the flower, and the pollination happens because they have to visit so many. If you think of something, say, like a bumblebee queen, the bumblebees hibernate over winter. Mrs. Bumblebee Queen comes out in the month of March, those big white-tailed bumblebees. And Mrs. Queen has to set up the nest, lay the eggs, and get the babies going before she goes into full-time egg production. She has to visit 60,000 flowers to gather enough pollen and nectar to equip the job, to lay the eggs, to feed the babies, to get the show on the road. So what do we have in our gardens in March? We have bloody daffodils, which don't have any nectar, don't have any pollen. What they're doing there, I do not know. Did you ever see a daffodil seed? No, we grow them from bulbs, don't we? They don't have any smell, don't have any nectar, don't have any pollen. Tulips are the same. They don't have this in them. And yet, when we have wonderful things, full of nectar, full of pollen, we call them by rude names and get rid of them. And I'm looking at you, dandelion. Dandelions have huge amounts of nectar and pollen. They're around very early in the year, and they're a great source of food for bumblebees. So it's a matter of knowing what you have and what you have. And all garden flowers are not bad. There's loads of them that aren't. I'm just picking on those 2 ones, for example. But in fact, what we have, things like snowdrops, things like crocuses, things like grape hyacinths, they do have nectar. They're fine. I mean, the insects will come to those. So when you're planting out stuff in your garden, you really have to know what's going on, because you can enjoy lovely flowers that are garden flowers, and they can do good for wildlife as well. Now here's a very smart-arsed thing. This is a hawk moth. It's actually a moth, it's not a bird, and it's called a hummingbird hawk moth because it behaves the way hummingbirds in America do. Hummingbirds in America have big long bills, they stick them into the flowers and they drink the nectar. Here's the hummingbird hawk moth. You can see its tongue doing the same thing. Now this is on a hiding to nothing. This thing is not going near the flower, not getting its head all dirty, it's just stealing the drink. And if their flowers had to depend on these for pollination, it wouldn't last long, because this thing is taking the free drink and not doing the work. So that is terrible. Now here's a big field down in County, I've done Wexford, I think. It's one of these places where the field has been made bigger in order that you can grow more crops. You don't be wasting space with hedges. You don't be wasting space with anything that would be taken away from the grants that you get for the amount of land you have. And you can see the big combine harvesters going around and round. And looking at the pattern there, you can see where the old hedgerows were, all been taken out. You can see the bumps in the soil in the big field. Now those hedgerows were full of plants that had nectar, that had pollen, that had various insects for bigger things to eat. Your grain field like that now is absolutely a desert as far as things are concerned. To make that grain grow, you have to add fertilizers to the soil because you're cutting away the grain, taking it away, taking the nutrients in the crop obviously with you, and we haven't done enormous amounts of this in Ireland. This is why this stands out. But you can imagine in other countries where you have huge, enormous fields, prairies and things like this, the amount of places where wildlife can live is becoming diminished. So I suppose, like everything else, you could be here till the cows come home saying, here's an example of this and here's an example of that. But we're here today to know what we can actually do to make a difference. Us, ourselves, in the way that we operate in the different things we do, whether it's in schools, in tidy towns, in our own gardens, whatever. Now, so what does it take to make a difference? And the first thing is, we have to bloody well know. If we don't know, how can we do anything about it? And that's called education, raising your awareness, learning about it. And this has only come in, I suppose, when I was at school. I went to school in the 1960s, and there was no leaving cert biology. It wasn't a subject, it wasn't taught in primary schools, there was no environmental education, but there was loads of Irish on the curriculum because that had been changed. So we get our father can be with all the kind of Gael gan Tom our father. But having actual environmental education wasn't around in the 60s. So the amount of awareness that we've had to get, and people that were grown up then or in school then had to learn it for themselves. Nowadays, of course, there's biology on the leaving cert, there's environmental awareness courses in universities, the schools are teaching all of this, they're having school gardens. So the amount of education formally that has happened over the last 40 years has been wonderful. So we can't say we don't know anymore. But then knowing about it is one thing. Caring about it is another. We have to care what happens to our surroundings. Do we really want to get rid of all them old hedges and shacks and get rid of the whole environment like I showed you in that house? Do we really want to tarmac the front and back garden because it's too dreadful to be having to be looking after the garden? Do we really want to put down plastic grass and think nobody will notice? We have to care what happens. And one of the things, not that there was ever any benefit of having COVID, but one of the things that happened during that time was that people were confined to living or walking or moving in a very confined area of 2 kilometres, 5 kilometres, your own county. And it made people very much aware of what was going on all around them. And indeed, in some instances, various groups were having photographic competitions, and I was judging all kinds of pictures from different places that were sending in pictures of what they saw on their daily work or whatever. So people were beginning to become aware of what was in their surroundings. And then thinking, well, is this all? Could we improve it? Could we do something else? Could we do something about it ourselves? Or could we bait up those in authority if we can't do it ourselves? So these are the kind of things that it takes to make a difference. We have to know, we have to care, and we have to push to have it done or do it ourselves. And there's no point in saying, aren't they awful and they won't do this, that, and the other. We are all responsible for the bit of our environment that we're in. So there's all kinds of things about good practice. There's all kinds of steps we can take. So if you're doing this on a larger basis, you could do a survey, you could find out what's actually there. When I go to school sometimes, I ask the kids in school, what trees have you got in your school grounds? As I come into the school, I can see what they have. And they'll say, we have an oak tree. I say, so where's the oak tree? So they only know the name of the oak tree. They may not have an oak tree in the school at all, but this is the tree whose name they know. So, even in the school, finding out what's there, we go out in the field trip, we have a look, Do you have an oak tree? What's this tree? What's that tree? What's there? Make a survey of what's there. Similarly, if it's a tidy town, if it's a group, if it's whatever, what have you got in the town in the first place? What's there? Because you want to see what you have before you start doing anything else. And then you must make sure you're doing the right thing. So you need to have consultation, you need to have advice, particularly if you're a group that has maybe a few bob. You want to make sure you're buying the right plants, you want to make sure you're putting them in correctly, that they'll grow, all of this kind of thing. So you could get a lot of advice for free. People are anxious that this all happens, so people who know things could be very well willing to part with information. And then, of course, you have to have awareness of protected sites. We have, only for the EU, we'd have none. We joined the EU in the 1970s, thank God for them. Only for that, I don't suppose to be anywhere protected. But under a new EU environmental law, we have special sites for birds, we have special SAC, special areas of conservation, we have national heritage areas. We have been forced to designate these under European law. So if any of these are around your area, you must be aware of these because these are protected. Then long-term management plans. There's no point in having a rush of blood to the head, planting something 1 year and then that's it done, and it has to be managed. There has to be a long-term management. And local biodiversity plans are quite often things that are drawn up, particularly in groups that might be, doing tidy towns or whatever. You have a biodiversity plan for 3 years, 5 years. More and more of the local authorities are appointing biodiversity officers. More and more of the management in local authorities is towards positive biodiversity. You see a lot more allowance of places to become wildflower meadows, places not to be mowed, all of this kind of thing. So other good practices then, so we can maintain the existing habitats. So, there might be already trees there, so we can plant more. And then, as Peter was saying, planting local, planting native is much better than this. And you inform your local bodies, you inform what you're doing, you put up your signs, you say what it is, and indeed you might decide to replace a lost habitat. Sometimes habitats are lost, mowing happens, sometimes things are dug up, sometimes riverside trees are cut down and tarmac is put in or something, and you might want to replace lost habitats. I had a picture of a graveyard there in the other one. I didn't say why I had a graveyard, because sometimes there are groups to restore graveyards. Graveyards, particularly ones that are historic graveyards, are wonderful places for wildlife, and they you want to be careful with them. Sometimes the old chapels and churches and buildings are all held up with ivy, and people get rid of all the ivy and the whole thing falls down because the ivy is holding it together. So ivy is a native plant. Ivy is a great place for biodiversity. Trees with ivy on them. Ivy is part of the biodiversity, part of our native plants. They grow up things to get to the light. They'll grow up trees, and they live in harmony with the trees. Now, as the trees get older, like people, they lose their hair, they get thin on top, and the ivy has more light. Ivy is an evergreen species, so it'll be there. It can grow in the winter time as well. So these trees can get more and more ivy as they get older, and then eventually, if you have two trees, one with ivy, one with not, and a great storm comes, the heavy tree with the ivy will blow down first. But the ivy didn't kill the tree. The ivy just made the tree heavier. Fatter things die quicker than thin things, the doctors tell us, I don't know. But think of all the biodiversity that ivy had. Think of all the nectar in the flowers. Think of all the places where the spiders could live, the cover for the birds' nests, the amount of biodiversity that was there. So replacing lost habitat then, as I was saying, on sound advice. So then your wildflower meadows, if you're going to plant wildflower meadow seeds, make sure you get Irish seeds. Don't just buy any old thing that you see in some of these supermarket places that might have come in from France, might have come in from England. They might actually have plants in them that don't even occur in Ireland, that aren't native. And of course, if you have to just do good things, you have to stop doing bad things. And bad things are weed killers and pesticides. Now, you put out weed killers, that gets into the soil, it's bad for the earthworms. Killing the weeds by putting sprays on them is not necessary, and is certainly the antithesis of what you're doing if you're trying to increase biodiversity. You don't do the same for animals either. None of these blue pellets out for the slugs, because the slugs eat the blue pellets and the thrushes eat the slugs, and the thrushes get a big pain in their tummy and we don't have any thrushes, and we all say, oh, that's because the magpies ate them. No, that's because you put out blue pellets for the slugs, and they ate the slugs with the blue pellets in them. So there's actually a food chain, so bigger things eat smaller things and smaller things eat something else. So if you try to get rid of the smaller things, the poisons can accumulate in the environment and poison the bigger things. And in fact, at one point, there was this particular poison called neonicotinoids. And neonicotinoids were sprays that you could spray on your crops to stop the aphids eating them. But it didn't just affect the leaves. It actually got into the pollen, it got into the nectar, and bees and ladybirds and everything else. The bees that ate the pollen, that gathered up the nectar, they all got these poisons as well. But finally, they've been banned, by the EU. The EU banned these. Eventually, they had great discussions about it over a few years. Ireland, of course, sat in its hands and was neutral, didn't vote that it would be banned. But we had enough environmentally minded colleagues in Europe that they were able to carry it. So you can't spray neonicotinoids on things like Rose Clear and Baby Bio. They all had these neonicotinoids in them. Now, if you still have those products and they're on sale now here in the EU, they won't have that neonicotinoid ingredient in it, so that they're not doing it any longer. So you have to, it's like when you're learning about religion or something, you have to do good and avoid evil. So you have the two ends of the spectrum: do positive things for the environment on the one hand, and stop doing negative things. And stop planting red flowers. Bees can't see red. So if you think you're John Hind, you're making up for God, you're planting lovely roses and red tulips and begonias and petunias and peony roses, all red colours. There are no wild red flowers. Oh, I know you'll be all saying there's poppies, but poppies are big open flowers. The bees we have a spectrum, we can see on the spectrum. We can see from the rainbow colours, essentially, from violet all the way down as far as red. But so that the wavelengths are getting longer as you go down. Now the bees, on the other hand, they start at green and they can see shorter and shorter up to violet, and then they can see ultraviolet. So to them, something like a poppy that's open has ultraviolet lines in it, and when the bees look at it, it's lit up like Dublin Airport at night time, and they can come right into the flower. But something like a rose, something like that beautiful rose, it's like a bloody cabbage. How would you get in there if you were a bee, even if you could see it? And I put out the challenge. I said, if anyone has a bee or any kind of a bumblebee or a honeybee on a red flower collecting nectar, would you please send me the picture of it? And I'm still waiting for the picture. The same as I'm waiting for the picture of the bat that flew into people's hairs, or the picture of the squirrel hibernating in the wintertime. You have a lot of way to go telling people that what they know to be true is not necessarily true. There's plenty of other colours. You don't need red flowers. I mean, the bees, I think, are Roscommon supporters or Clare supporters or Tipperary supporters. They love, or indeed Ukrainian supporters, they love the colours yellow and purple, yellow and blue. They're the colours that the insects really love. But they like other colours too, but not red. So there you go. So there's your wildflower meadow, and you can see you mightn't get a huge amount of silage off that if you're a farmer, because obviously land use change has had a huge impact on biodiversity. But on the other hand, if you're not a farmer and you don't have to be mowing your garden every 5 minutes with your lawnmower, burning fossil fuel, mowing the grass, calling the wildflowers rude names like weeds, it's not on. You have to change how you think and care enough. So, I'll be having a workshop this afternoon. I have a book called Our Wild World with all of this in it, and we can talk about the actual things we can do, the nitty-gritty of all of this. But in the meanwhile, my time is up. Thank you all very much for your attention, and I'll talk to you later on. Go raibh míle maith.